The bells of Saint-Denis tolled with a mournful rhythm, echoing through the gray sky of a kingdom on the edge of exhaustion. France, once radiant under the Sun King, now staggered beneath mountains of debt, famine-haunted villages, and a nobility, drained of blood and coin from endless wars. And in the midst of this ruin, the crown, too heavy for any mortal, was lowered upon the head of a boy barely old enough to hold it upright. He was only 5 years old, a child with wide, sorrowful eyes dressed in velvet stitched with gold that seemed to mock his fragility. His parents had both perished of disease before he could remember their faces. Now, surrounded by courtiers whose powdered wigs and painted faces masked serpentine ambitions, he stood silent before a throne that glowed like a cage. The boy's name was Louis, but whispers in the corridors called him other things. The orphan king, the lamb among wolves, the shadow of Versailles. The regent, a cunning prince with thin lips and eyes sharp as a knife's edge, stepped forward to announce the boy's rule. Courtiers applauded, though the sound was hollow, like bones rattling in a crypt. The child's gaze flickered not to the throne, but to the vast gilded mirrors of the hall of Versailles. In their reflection, he did not see glory. He saw himself, dwarfed, fragile, a pale figure devoured by the shine of gold and the weight of history. Outside, peasants starved in silence. Inside, the nobility whispered, wagering how long the boy would survive. Some said he would not see manhood, that the crown itself would consume him. In the months that followed, Louis was given the finest tutors, masters of Latin, of philosophy, of history, of war. They praised his mind, sharp as the winter wind, and his memory, vast as the cathedrals. Yet his nights were haunted by visions, his parents coughing blood into linens, corpses bloated in the mud of war, the skeletal faces of peasants pressing against the iron gates of Versailles. The boy learned quickly that knowledge could be a weapon, but not a shield. He absorbed the lessons of kingship, to speak with grace, to mask weakness, to smile even when the heart was ash. He did not yet know that these lessons would one day twist into his undoing. Versailles was a palace of splendor, but for Louis, it was a labyrinth of shadows. Behind silk curtains and gilded doors, secrets festered. He once wandered into a hidden corridor and overheard two nobles debating his fate. "The child is malleable," one whispered. "He will be shaped by whomever grasps his leash first." "Or broken," the other replied coldly. "The blood of kings is strong but not invincible. Too much pressure and it curdles into madness." The boy fled, but their words clung to him like cobwebs. Despite his loneliness, there were moments of fragile warmth. His governess, a stern woman with kind eyes, would read him tales of heroes who fought monsters and ruled with justice. "You, too, can be such a king," she told him once, brushing his hair as he drifted into sleep. But even in his dreams, the monsters wore powdered wigs and carried scepters. As years passed, Louis grew taller, his features sharpening into a beauty that made courtiers murmur of destiny. When he walked through the gardens of Versailles, peasants pressed forward to glimpse him. "Le bien-aimé," they cried, "the well-beloved." For a moment he felt hope flicker like a candle in the wind. Perhaps he could heal the wounds of his kingdom, yet beneath the marble floors of Versailles, the rot had already begun. Ministers stole coin from the treasury, priests grew fat while peasants withered, and the regent whispered lies into the boys' ear. In the dead of night, Louis often crept to the chapel, kneeling before the crucifix, begging silently, "Do not let me be devoured." But shadows do not heed prayers. By his 12th year, Louis had already tasted betrayal. A trusted tutor, the only man he believed truly cared for him, was suddenly dismissed, exiled for speaking too freely against the regent. The boy wept alone in his chambers, clutching the last book the tutor had given him, a history of Rome, filled with stories of emperors who rose as saviors but died as tyrants. The pages trembled in his hands, as if whispering a warning meant only for him. Louis was beloved, yes, but beloved in the way a candle is admired before it burns out. In the gilded mirrors of Versailles, the boy still saw himself, but each year, the reflection grew more haunted, more burdened by a crown that glowed like a chain. The kingdom waited, breathless. Would he rise as savior? Or would he be swallowed whole by the very throne he was born to occupy? The answer, though hidden then, had already begun to write itself in the silence of those endless corridors, where whispers slithered like snakes, and the scent of decay lingered just beneath the perfume of roses. The first whispers of manhood came to Louis not with triumph, but with temptation. He was no longer a child. At 13 years old he stood taller, his features maturing into the kind of beauty that painters long to immortalize. His dark hair framed a face both delicate and solemn, his eyes holding the heavy silence of someone who had listened too long to secrets meant for older ears. Versailles, which had once been a labyrinth of fear, now became a theater, one where he was not merely an actor, but the reluctant centerpiece. The court had begun to adore him in earnest. He was called Le Bien-Aimé, the well-beloved, his image painted in glorious oils, his likeness stamped on metals, his smile rehearsed for the adoration of the masses. But behind the masks of loyalty, every smile carried a dagger. Ministers, mistresses in waiting, foreign envoys. They circled him like moths drawn to a flame. The boy who had once prayed in the chapel for salvation now found himself seduced by pleasures carefully placed before him. A banquet hall filled, with golden chalices and wines as red as blood. Gardens where masked courtiers whispered flattery, their eyes promising secrets of the flesh. Perfumed halls where laughter echoed like distant bells, promising escape from the suffocating weight of kingship. Louis resisted at first. The memory of his governess's stories, of noble rulers who sacrificed their own happiness for justice, still lingered in him. But temptation is patient, and temptation wears many faces. It came one night in the form of a masquerade ball. The palace was lit by 1,000 candles, mirrors doubling the flames until it seemed as though Versailles itself was on fire. Louis, dressed in a costume of silver and black, wandered through the sea of masks. He felt both invisible and exposed, as though the crown still weighed upon his head even in disguise. And then he saw her. She wore a mask of ivory trimmed with gold, her lips painted crimson, her movements fluid as though she glided rather than walked. She curtsied deeply, her gaze fixed upon him with a boldness that pierced his soul. "A king should not walk alone," she whispered. The words, though simple, struck like an arrow. For years he had been alone, surrounded by courtiers but never companions. That night in the gardens, under the marble statues of forgotten gods, Louis tasted something sweeter than duty: desire. Her name was never spoken in public, but within the shadows of Versailles everyone knew. She was not merely a woman, she was a symbol, the first of many who would twist his reign into scandal, her beauty becoming a mirror for his own weakness. Yet Louis convinced himself it was love. Days became weeks, and with each secret encounter, his heart swayed further from the weight of responsibility. Ministers complained of his absence in council. Priests whispered sermons of sin. Peasants muttered about rising taxes while the king strolled hand in hand through Versailles gardens, intoxicated by youth and longing. But temptation is never free. One evening, while walking the corridors after a tryst, Louis stumbled upon a chamber he had never seen. Its door was ajar, torchlight spilling across the marble floor. Curious, he entered. What he found there would never leave him. It was a torture chamber, hidden beneath the palace itself. Chains hung from the walls, iron instruments glistened with old stains, and in the center lay a man, broken, bloodied, barely breathing. A noble accused of treason, left to rot by order of the regent. The man's eyes met Louis's, wide with a plea no words could carry. "Mercy," he croaked, his voice barely more than a rattle. Louis froze. For a moment, he felt the echo of his governess's tales, of heroes who brought justice, of kings who healed their land. He wanted to speak, to order the man's release, but then he heard footsteps. The regent entered, his face calm, his voice smooth as silk. "Do you see, Majesty? This is what it means to rule. Love, compassion. These are luxuries for poets. Power demands blood." Louis said nothing. He turned and walked away, but the image of the broken man followed him into his dreams, staining even the sweetness of his secret love. That night, lying in his chambers, he realized the truth. The throne was not a gift. It was a poisoned chalice, gilded to hide its bitterness. The people still cheered him as le bien-aimé. They waved banners, sang songs, and believed their young king was destined for greatness. But in the mirrors of Versailles, Louis saw only shadows, lengthening behind him. Shadows that whispered of pleasure, corruption, and chains that could not be broken. The child who once prayed for salvation had stepped into the garden of temptation, and the garden had already begun to devour him. When Louis reached his 17th year, the regency dissolved. The crown that had once been suspended above him like a shadow now fell firmly into his grasp. The boy was gone. A young man stood in his place, tall and elegant, clothed in silks that shimmered like liquid flame, crowned with the weight of centuries. Versailles roared with celebration. Courtiers raised their goblets, priests blessed the moment, and the people beyond the gilded gates sang songs of hope. To them, Louis was still le bien-aimé, the beloved, the chosen one who would heal France from years of war and hunger. But within the chambers of power, a different voice whispered. Ministers spoke of enemies on the borders, of debts that chained the kingdom, of enemies who laughed at France's weakness. Louis, still intoxicated by youth and desperate to prove himself, listened. "Majesty," one minister said, "a king who does not command war is no king at all." The words struck deep. Louis, who had once walked the gardens hand in hand with his masked muse, now found himself clutching maps of Europe instead of her fingers. The regent's lessons still lingered. Mercy was weakness, compassion a poet's dream. Thus came his baptism of blood. War erupted like a storm. Cannons thundered across distant fields. Soldiers marched under banners painted with lilies. Drums beat the rhythm of sacrifice. From Versailles, Louis watched reports arrive. Numbers, names, victories, and deaths, written neatly on parchment as though blood could be measured in ink. The first battles were triumphant. Messengers brought word of victories, and the court erupted in feasts. Painters immortalized Louis as a warrior king, his image astride a white horse, sword raised high against the heavens. The people cheered. France seemed reborn, but triumph is fleeting. The tide turned swiftly. The enemy regrouped, alliances shattered, and the battlefield became a graveyard. Reports of slaughter piled higher than the feasts that celebrated them. Villages burned, peasants starved, soldiers deserted. One winter evening, Louis rode to the front himself. He wanted to taste the glory, to prove to the world that he was no mere puppet of ministers. What he found instead was horror. The battlefield stretched endlessly, a wasteland of mud and corpses. Broken wagons lay scattered like bones, crows feasted upon the unburied dead, and the snow itself was stained red. Louis dismounted, his boots sinking into the mire. A soldier, half dead, crawled toward him. His face was disfigured, his arm gone, his breath rattling like dry leaves. "Majesty," the soldier whispered, we fight for you. Give us meaning." Louis knelt, trembling. But before he could answer, the man exhaled his last breath. That night, by the fires of the camp, Louis sat in silence while generals debated strategy. He could still see the soldiers' empty eyes, accusing him without words. He had sought glory, but instead found damnation. Yet he did not stop the war. The regent's voice echoed in his skull. Power demands blood. And so the young king hardened his heart. He began to issue commands with cold precision, his once trembling hand steady as he signed orders that consigned thousands to death. France bled, and Versailles shone brighter than ever. Banquets grew more lavish, mistresses more numerous, masks more elaborate. Louis danced by candlelight even as soldiers rotted in shallow graves. Each toast in the Hall of Mirrors was echoed by a scream in the mud. But in his dreams, Louis could not escape. The tortured noble from the chamber, the soldier's lifeless stare, The masked woman's crimson lips. They merged into one endless nightmare. He would awaken in sweat, gripping the sheets as though they were chains. The people still cheered him. The song still called him Le Bien-Aimé. But beneath the songs, murmurs spread, whispers of famine, of taxes that crushed the poor, of sons who never returned from war. Louis had taken his first steps as a ruler, and each step was soaked in blood. The baptism was complete, but salvation was nowhere to be found. The war had ended, but peace brought no healing. France was left bruised, her fields barren, her coffers hollow. Yet Versailles glittered brighter than ever. Louis had returned from the battlefield not with humility, but with a hunger he could not name. The sight of corpses haunted him. The stench of blood clung to his robes, yet instead of retreating into repentance, he flung himself into the arms of excess. Banquets stretched long into the night, filled with roasted swans, fountains of wine, and women masked in velvet. Musicians played until their fingers bled, dancers spun until they collapsed in exhaustion, and the king demanded more, always more. The masked woman who had once walked beside him in the gardens returned to his dreams. Her lips, crimson like spilled blood, whispered in his ear, "Forget them, forget the dead. You are the sun, burn, and let the world wither." Louis obeyed. Mistresses multiplied, their beauty paraded like jewels upon his arm. Noble families offered their daughters, like tributes to a god they no longer believed in, desperate to secure favor. Behind lace curtains, laughter echoed, but it was hollow, brittle, like glass ready to shatter. At night, when the candles dimmed, Louis found no rest. Shadows crawled across the ceilings of Versailles. He would wake gasping, convinced that cold hands clawed at his throat, the same hands of soldiers who had died whispering his name. To drown the whispers, he built a theater of masks. Masquerade balls became his kingdom's heartbeat. Every week, courtiers donned silks and feathers, faces hidden behind painted porcelain. The Hall of Mirrors was transformed into a labyrinth of deception, where truth itself vanished in the glitter of chandeliers. Louis wandered through these nights like a phantom. Sometimes he laughed too loudly. Sometimes he stared too long into the mirrors, as though expecting to see not his reflection, but the hollow eyes of the dead. The regent's voice had once warned him, "Mercy is weakness." Now another voice replaced it. Pleasure is power. And yet beneath the revelry, rot spread. Famine crept into villages. Peasants clawed for bread. Mothers wept over empty cradles. Their suffering was muffled by distance, drowned beneath the music of Versailles. But Louis could feel it in his bones, an invisible sickness gnawing at his reign. One night during a grand masquerade, the vision came. The hall blazed with candlelight. Dancers swirled, masks of angels and demons colliding in the rhythm of harpsichords. Louis stood at the center, draped in crimson silk, a golden mask hiding half his face. Then across the room, he saw her, the woman in the red mask, unchanged, as though she had stepped out of his childhood garden. Her gown shimmered like spilled wine, her eyes glowed like embers. She approached, each step echoing louder than the music itself. "Majesty," she whispered, pressing her cold hand into his, "you cannot flee them forever. The dead will always dance beside you." Louis froze. Around him, the masquerade dissolved into grotesque shapes. Dancers became corpses, feathers turned to ashes, music warped into screams. He stumbled backward, tearing off his mask, gasping for air. But when he looked again, she was gone. Only the laughter of courtiers remained, oblivious, their masks hiding nothing but emptiness. That night, Louis locked himself in his chamber. He smashed mirrors, overturned goblets, and cursed the specter that followed him. Yet even as he raged, he felt her lips still whispering against his ear. He was no longer beloved. He was haunted. Versailles, for all its light, had become a tomb. The scent of roses no longer lingered in Versailles. Instead, a stench of rot crept through the gilded halls, subtle at first, then undeniable. It began with whispers, servants coughing blood into handkerchiefs, stable boys collapsing in the courtyards, a maid found stiff and cold before dawn. The court dismissed it as rumor, as peasant disease, but the shadows carried faster than truth, and soon the rot reached the king's gates. Louis, ever cloaked in silk and decadence, tried to ignore it. He ordered more music, more wine, more masquerades. Yet even in the hall of mirrors behind, masks of gold and feathers, he saw it. The trembling hands of dancers, the fever in their eyes, the paleness beneath the powder. One evening, during a banquet, a nobleman collapsed face first into his roasted pheasant, blood spilling from his mouth like spilled wine. Gasps rippled through the hall. Musicians faltered, dancers froze, but Louis only sat in silence, staring, his goblet unmoving. The dead noble's mask slipped, revealing eyes wide and glazed, staring at nothing. The banquet ended in chaos. From then on, death stalked Versailles, openly. Doctors with bird-beak masks patrolled the corridors, their pouches heavy with herbs and vinegar. Servants burned sheets in the gardens. The smell of smoke mixed with rot, turning the air acrid, but no fire could cleanse what had taken root. At night, Louis wandered the darkened corridors. He no longer sought pleasure, but shadows. He pressed his ear against locked chambers and heard coughing, weeping, scratching at doors. Once he opened a door and found a maid writhing on the floor, her body covered in black sores. Her eyes rolled back, yet when she saw him she whispered, "Majesty, forgive me." Louis stumbled back, slamming the door, but the whisper followed. Him. "Majesty, forgive me." The woman in the red mask haunted his dreams still, but her face had changed. Now her mask was cracked, and beneath it he glimpsed decayed flesh. She reached for him, her fingers bone-thin, her voice like a dirge. "This is not the plague of peasants, Louis. This is the plague of kings." Versailles became a mausoleum. Tapestries sagged with dust. Chandeliers hung dim, their crystals dull. Once lively courtiers fled, claiming pilgrimage, though none returned. Those who remained hid in their chambers, their silks stained with sweat, their whispers trembling. Louis sat alone in the hall of mirrors. He gazed upon his reflection but saw not himself, only a man with hollow cheeks, eyes sunken, skin pale, as wax. The golden mask lay on the table before him, cracked down the middle. He reached for it but could not bear to put it on. The whispers grew louder. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, to exhale rot. Sometimes Louis swore he saw shadows, moving in the mirrors, dead soldiers, dead courtiers, the regent himself, all watching him, all waiting. Then came the night when the bells tolled without command. A storm raged above Versailles, lightning slashing the sky. The chapel bells rang though no priest pulled their ropes. Louis, trembling, descended into the chapel, the sound shaking his bones. There he found the pews empty, yet the altar was drenched in blood, not fresh, but thick, black, and foul. Upon the altar lay a mask, the red mask of the woman. When he reached for it, the mask dissolved into ash. Louis fell to his knees, screaming, but no voice answered him, only the echo of the bells tolling, death. Versailles had become a tomb, and he its prisoner. Versailles was no longer a palace of light but a fortress of shadows. The plague gnawed at its walls, but within a different sickness festered. Fear. Louis, once adored, now ruled with paranoia. He trusted no one, not the nobles who still clung to their titles, not the priests who spoke of repentance, not even his lovers, whose lips he now feared carried whispers of poison. The hall of mirrors became a tribunal. Courtiers were dragged, in chains, accused of conspiring with the dead, of summoning pestilence, of mocking the throne. Some were guilty of nothing but trembling in his presence. Louis sat upon a gilded chair, eyes hollow, wig disheveled, hands trembling yet resolute. "Confess," he whispered to the first prisoner, a trembling duke. The man swore his loyalty. Louis ordered him to the dungeons. The dungeons beneath Versailles had long been forgotten, but now they echoed with screams. Torturers returned to their art with grim devotion. Flesh burned, bones cracked, nails were torn one by one. The corridors smelled of iron and rot, louder even than the scent of plague. Louis descended often, lantern in hand, to watch. His eyes, fever bright, lingered on every grim detail. The cracking of whips was music to him, a rhythm drowning out. The tolling of unseen bells. Confess, he would say to men and women alike. Some confessed crimes they never committed. Some confessed to impossible sins, feasting with demons, dancing with the red-masked woman, poisoning the king's dreams. Every confession fed Louis's delusion. Yet even as blood stained the dungeon, stones rebellion stirred above. Servants whispered of escape, nobles bribed guards. The court fractured. Some clung to the king's madness, others plotted to flee. One night, Louis's chief physician dared to speak the truth. "Majesty, it is not demons nor courtiers who kill us. It is the plague. The people demand you leave." Versailles, before the words ended, Louis struck him across the face. "Silence. You speak as they do. You are one of them." The physician was taken that night to the Crimson Chamber, the darkest of the dungeons. His screams lasted until dawn. And so the king's paranoia became bloodlust. The woman in the red mask visited him still. She appeared at the foot of his bed in candlelight, whispering, "Every scream is your hymn, every drop of blood your crown. But when the last voice falls silent, who will remain to sing?" Louis woke in sweat. His sheets stained crimson, though no wound marked him. As weeks passed, Versailles was soaked not only in pestilence but terror. Tapestries muffled screams, yet the walls remembered. Guards turned against one another. Courtiers disappeared overnight, their names struck from memory as if they had never existed. Louis himself had begun to change. His reflection showed not a king, but a gaunt phantom, lips cracked, eyes ringed in shadow. His robes hung loose on his withering frame. Yet still he clung to power, convinced the throne itself kept him alive. One night, as lightning split the skies, he ordered a feast. Only a handful attended, pale nobles, trembling, their silks damp with sweat. The table was laden with food, but no one touched it. Louis raised his goblet. "To loyalty," he croaked. None replied. And then, with a tremor in his voice, he added, "To the blood that binds us." A servant carrying wine collapsed at his feet, blood spilling across the marble. Louis laughed, a sound raw and broken. "This is the sacrament," he said. "Drink and live forever." But no one moved. The feast ended in silence, each guest fleeing as soon as they dared. That night, the dungeon fires burned hotter, and the screams reached even the highest towers. Versailles was no longer a palace. It was a cathedral of death, and Louis its high priest. The Palace of Mirrors had become a palace of screams. Outside, the plague blackened the countryside. Villages lay in silence, bells tolling only for the dead. Inside Versailles, the screams of the tortured bled into the cries of the dying. The air was thick with incense and rot, perfumed attempts to hide the stench of despair. Whispers of rebellion grew bolder. Guards abandoned their posts, bribed by nobles desperate to flee. Servants vanished in the night. The kitchens were empty. The fountains ran dry. Versailles was hollowing out, like a corpse feeding upon itself. Louis wandered the halls like a ghost. His once magnificent wig now clung to him in greasy strands, his robes trailing as if weighed down by invisible chains. His crown no longer rested upon his head but upon the banquet table, where it sat tarnished and forgotten, like a relic of a god already dead. At night he still saw her, the woman in the red mask. She followed him in dreams and waking hours alike. Sometimes she sat beside him, silent, stroking his trembling hands. Sometimes she laughed, the sound echoing like bells of morning. "Majesty," she whispered one night, "they do not fear you anymore. They only fear death, and death does not obey kings." Louis struck the air as if to silence her, but she dissolved into the shadows, leaving only the echo of her words. The courtiers who remained plotted in whispers. Some spoke of fleeing to the countryside. Others spoke of seizing the throne. A few, consumed by terror, sought to appease Louis by betraying their own kin. Blood flowed not only in the dungeons but in gilded chambers, where knives flashed between brothers. The rebellion began in the kitchens. Servants, gaunt and starving, rose with knives and fire. Guards joined them, some seeking vengeance, others only survival. Flames licked the tapestries, and the gold of Versailles flickered red. Louis was in the Hall of Mirrors when the chaos reached him. The mirrored walls reflected not the grandeur of the court, but twisted images of fire and blood. He stood alone, a trembling shadow surrounded by infinite phantoms of himself. The doors burst open. Servants stormed in, faces blackened with soot, armed with cleavers and rusted swords. Behind them came deserter guards, shouting curses. Louis raised his trembling hand as though to command silence, but no voice obeyed. "You brought the plague upon us," one cried. "You fed us to demons," another screamed. They rushed him. The king stumbled backward, crashing against the mirrors. Glass shattered, slicing his flesh. His blood painted the reflections red. For a moment, silence. Then he laughed. A raw, broken sound. "I am France," he whispered. "You cannot kill me." The mob dragged him from the hall. They did not kill him swiftly. He was dragged through the burning corridors, beaten with fists, his robe torn to shreds. At last, in the courtyard, they bound him to a column where fountains once sang. Now the basins were filled with black water and ash. The woman in the red mask appeared among the crowd. She alone stood still, untouched by flame or blade. She lifted her mask slowly, revealing nothing but a hollow void. Louis screamed, but no sound came. His voice had been stolen. The mob jeered, their cries mingling with the crackle of fire. They demanded blood. They demanded an end. The first stone struck him, then another. Soon, the air was filled with rocks and curses. His body sagged, his blood soaking the marble he once ruled. And as his last breath rattled from his chest, he saw Versailles collapse around him. Towers crumbled. Flames devoured silk and gold, and the court that had once glittered brighter than. The sun was swallowed by darkness. The age of kings ended not with ceremony but with ashes and screams.